I'm Noah Castro. I'm a student at the University of New Haven in Connecticut. I'm a third-year music and sound recording student with a Bachelor in Arts, and a musician and producer. So today we're going to be discussing a topic that may not necessarily go fully appreciated in most video games, and that is the idea of sound fonts. First off, let's start off with a quote by a dead guy. The enemy of art is the absence of limitations by Orson Welles. And for those of you wondering who Orson Welles is, he's the guy that made Citizen Kane, arguably regarded as like one of the quintessential reference films of all time. It's like one of the main films that people go to reference. He kind of knows what he's talking about. But like, especially, while this applies to pretty much any medium, video games, specifically, benefit the most from this saying. Like, it supports it the best. Because you have so many limitations to the point where you feel like there's no breathing room. There's no breathing room for anything else on the console. Well, today we're going to delve into how exactly this technology was able to revolutionize video games and create the sounds and music that we remember today as classics. So here's just a quick overview of what we're going to discuss. So we're going to go over like what the basic idea of it is, how the NES processed it to sort of contextualize what's to come, how the Super Nintendo wound it up, Sega's attempts in the ring, Sony, and later Nintendo. We're going to be talking about how each of these sounds gave each system a distinct sound and personality, and then also talk about its impact. So first off, what exactly is a sound font? Now, before all of you try going to plug in your headphones into your iPhones and try to listen to the next big hits from Times New Roman, let me explain. So this basically refers to a file format that utilizes MIDI-based sampling for all of its sounds. So to put it in another term, you have a separate channel where MIDI instructions are, and another channel where all of these sound bytes are, and you cross-reference them very frequently to match sounds or pitched sound to a synthesizer. Bum, 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 bum. Something like that. And this technology was created in the early 90s by Creative and EMU Systems as a way to sort of get these sounds into digital synthesizer keyboards, kind of like this one, and give them a special format, the SBK, which is short for Sound Bank, or the later Sound Bank 2. But we'll get into that later. So, how specifically does it work? So, and to go into a little bit more detail, all of these sound font samples are put into a bank, which are stored onto a ROM chip or a file. And this file serves as your reference point. So you couldn't use WAV files when you first started out with these things. Use what are called PCMs, which is basically a way to put it in a way that the synthesizer will understand. Pulse code modulator is what it stands for. So each shift was pitch shifted. You could use the standard preset MIDI notes, which were commonplace at the time, and would often include those weird instruments like bird chirps, gunshots, helicopters. And it's all because they were used for PC. But they were also used in regular synthesizers. Not only could you control notes, but you could also control vibrato effects, loops, and velocity-sensitive volume changing, which basically means you have dynamics. You can have something that's really soft or really loud. So while these were originally for synthesizer instruments, it would be systems like the NES that would show first signs of delving into this technology in a video game console. So let's start off with the NES. So the NES, it utilized a Rico 2A03 or Rico 2A07 sound processor chip, depending on which part of the world you're in. Collectively, on the main board, there were only 2 kilobytes of RAM, which is basically nothing. You had like very minimal to work on. And the sound processor was able to process 5 main types of tracks. You have two square waves, which sound like this. you had, which were mostly for the main melody and harmonies. You had a triangle wave, which was usually the bass line. And you also had a white noise channel. Something like that. And then there's the other channel, the PCM channel, which is basically where the sound samples lie. So, because of this technology, it was very, very memory consuming to put in any long clips of dialogue or sound. So they were very rarely used. Although they were used in a few games, including a Sesame Street game for NES, where they had the Count talk very clearly into the mic to try to make as much best quality as it is. For as good as that sounded, though, arguably two of maybe more noticeable examples are in Blades of Steel, an old game which is basically hockey, where they used sound samples that sounded like this. That soundbite today kills me. But arguably, more notably, thank you, in Mario Brothers 3. That steel drum sound, which was used in the background, was that little oomph that gave the percussion a little bit more of an identity. And it was basically 2 or 3 different sound bits that were pitched slightly differently to sort of give the impression of like a kick steel drum and a snare steel drum. And that was probably like the most famous example. Remember how earlier I mentioned that you had sort of vibrato control? Well, we're not exactly at that peak stage yet, but in DuckTales, the Moon theme, if you listen very closely to the lead melody, you can hear a little bit of vibrato in there. Turn that down a little. Exactly. All right, stop before I get carried away. Before we all get carried away. Any objections? I'll leave these songs playing later. Okay, so for as fine and dandy as that is, we do have a fair share of limitations, as mentioned earlier. So like I said, the samples were very small. There were only 2 kilobytes put into the console's basic RAM. And most game files were less, like collectively, the games were about as large as 500 kilobytes, which is less than half of 1,000th of a gigabyte, which still pretty damn small. They had to recycle everything they could. They recycled assets from games. They recycled sound bites. In fact, in the original Mario Brothers, the flagpole theme, they reused that for the mushroom sound effect to save memory. You've never said if you slow that down, you'll hear do almost like the flagpole. So other than that, there were the vibrato, which sounds great in DuckTales. However, there's a catch. The sound chip was only able to have vibrato on certain notes without the system glitching. So you couldn't have songs where you'd say you'd have vibrato on a C. I can't use the keyboard right now, but the C, like notes like C, I think it was A1, F1, a few other notes. But arguably, a much larger one, which I'm about to show you next, is how when you have to put the sound effects into a game where the music is already taking up the 4 main channels, you kind of get this kind of effect. Just listen carefully as he runs into coins and jumps. Or, probably more noticeably, yep, it takes over one of the channels. See, you can't hear na 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 na, but you don't have the na in there because the NES doesn't know how to process it. So, to put it more simply, imagine if the Beatles only had 4 instruments to use ever. They could only have 1 voice, one guitar, one bass, and one drum. No sitar from Rubber Soul, nothing else. That's all they're stuck with. George Martin is too limited. He'd be kicking himself. But all right. So how do we go from here? Where do we go from here? Well, up. Welcome to the far superior Nintendo Entertainment System, creatively named the Super Nintendo. I know, really creative. Anyway, so this console was the first one to fully utilize Soundfont technology. No analog channels like in the NES. You had 8 separate channels in stereo where you can have different samples and different volumes fully, which is a huge step up because now you can have sound effects, but more importantly, you can use longer samples. Now, unfortunately, sometimes they're still down to the length of like 1 wavelength, which is like still pretty much nothing, but you couldn't utilize a full, a full drum loop still. You could, at best, do something like this. That's it. And this, actually, the reason it's here is, it like goes longer here is because it's programmed to loop. But that was also like a really huge upgrade for the SNES. But it also gave to this idea that, oh, we can use reverb. Although it isn't really reverb. It's more like a decay. It's more like a very slight echo after the main voice. And because of that, you get songs like Buy Something Will Ya from Earthbound, the song that you hear when you go into the shop. And you hear this. Now, if you're listening closely here with the banjo, exactly. It gives the illusion that they're taking up more space, but in actuality, it's just using another sound channel. Although, with that, there's an even better example of this that fully utilizes it and really masks how well you can actually make it sound without using actual reverb. And that is through the magic of David Wise's Donkey Kong Country 2 soundtrack. And more specifically in songs like Sticker Brush Symphony. And so you can hear the same idea of like a doubling voice. And this is all just a compressed version, which came from the Super Nintendo itself. However, when we take that song and expand it, it still sounds great, and it still masks it very well. It's just a testament to show like how well it holds up, more than anything else. Moving on from that, let's quickly talk about the Sega systems. So the Genesis actually had a slight leg up from their company because they were looking to be, faster than Sega. I mean, Sega's faster than Sega. Sega does when Nintendo don't, but like they had a leg up because they used a chip by Yamaha, which at that time was just developing a chip that was being developed at the University of Stanford. And they gave Sega exclusive rights, of all companies, to use this chip in their systems. And this gave them something slightly more flexible before the Super Nintendo came around, and also gave way to 4 separate channels, which you can program your own sounds to it. To jump ahead a little bit, with the Sega CD, to sort of like milk the life of the Genesis, because that's starting to ironically lose its life. But you found a console that gave birth to 8 new channels that used digital samples like the NES did, although significantly better quality, which means that you can now get full dialogue in there for Sega CD games, like what was it? Plumber's No, that was the 3DO. A few other. That's a good example. Yeah, no, I like. Snatcher, the definitive example. So like it actually lets you do that and also use a little bit of pre-recorded music, which I believe was also in Snatcher. So now is the time where the PlayStation is starting to hit the scene, and they come along and trump everything else. They have new channels. They have 3 times the channels, and they include a lot more this time around. They have the ability to loop stuff. They can pitch modulate. They can add actual reverb. They can include amplitude envelopes, which basically means you can control how quickly the sound comes in, how long it stays, and how quickly it goes out. And while it still supports MIDI, as most games did at the time, it was still that kind of time, you also had a better CD software that lets you process audio a lot more efficiently, and up to 41.1 hertz, which is the modern day industry standard for composing and compressing and mastering music that you'd find on CD or an MP3. Luckily, the audio didn't have to be compressed or have to be decompressed. They can make it allows more flexibility for any kind of sound they want. So with that, all of these consoles have had their own separate sound chips, and I think it's about time that we move on to Nintendo's biggest success, the Nintendo 64, or rather. That's right. We have one more Sega console to talk about, and well, it's the Saturn. Well, arguably, it kind of sucked commercially. It didn't do too well, especially after the 32X on the Sega Genesis and all that jazz. I bring this up because this is arguably the most flexible console that used MIDI. This console had 32 separate MIDI channels, which is 4 times what the Super Nintendo ever wished they could achieve. Also used by Yamaha, had like an exclusive contract where you use this chip, the YMF292F, to process all of its sounds. There weren't too many songs from the Sega Saturn, so finding sound fonts for this stuff is a nightmare. But I've yet to find it, and I'm waiting for Sega to come in and save me from it, or to bring some to me or something. He's a hero, I tell you. Anyway, so this utilized also the same industry standard of the main disc. You had 512 kilobits of audio. All is forgiven. All is forgiven, my child. Okay. Anyway, so with all of this going for it, and all this great CD technology and all this MIDI technology, the main drawback is that the audio samples here have to be decompressed to fit this memory buffer. And this kind of put a restriction on how many audio samples can be playing at the same time. Because of that, you couldn't get a fully immersive sound with like overlapping dialogue, or at least not too many of them. And you couldn't get songs, or you could get a lot of different songs, a lot of different samples you can plug in there. It was basically all there. It had so much going for it. It followed the 32X, and Sega was at this point starting to, well, not starting to, but like it was starting to dip its toes out of the console business and go exclusively into software. It's just a shame that Sega had to go this quickly. Anyway, so now we can move on to the N64. So all of these consoles so far have used an individual chip from the main processor, because putting the main processor chip and the sound chip on the same one can overlap and cause songs to clip in and out. It can cause, it can cause like a lot of different conflictions. So you think Nintendo would stick to what worked, right? No. To put it simply, no. They thought they'd get ahead of the competition. They thought it would be a fantastic idea to put the cartridges, put all of the sounds into the same chip to save processing, to make it much more efficient, and that methodology also kind of leaks in to how how they decided to stick with cartridges instead of CDs. Oh, actually, there is one more thing I do want to mention that I forgot to mention earlier about the PlayStation. So you know that iconic. That was all used in Soundfont to save processing on the original PlayStation. It was far more efficient to use that as a MIDI sample instead of an audio. And same with the bells and the glass shards. But anyway, back to '96. This console, it wasn't as powerful, or rather, it was powerful, but you couldn't get the same CD quality that the PlayStation or any of the consoles that came before it could. You had 48 kilohertz sounds. Now, luckily, probably one of the first steps above the SNES is its ability to add filters to it, which means you can diminish higher frequencies or accentuate low frequencies to create like a more dampened sound to make it sound like it's in the next room over, or higher frequencies to make it sound like it's kind of an airy sort of thing. You can still alter the dynamic of it, but you still run into this very prominent issue where we don't know if the music can even interfere. Like we don't know how many sound channels it has exactly because it shared a chip with the main processor, and that means that it was very dependent on the software that was used, which means that depending on the game, that game would dictate how many sound channels you can use at once. Okay, quick show of hands. Who here has played Mario Kart 64? All right. Who here has played Mario Kart 64 with 3 or more players? Congrats, you have more friends than I do. Okay, but more importantly, have you ever noticed how there's no music playing when you race? Well, you can thank this bad boy for that. You can think this is the reason why you can't hear Moo Moo Meadows playing in the background, or that's Mario Kart Wii. I mean, Toad's Turnpike or something. But yeah, no, this was very restrictive, and because it still relied on compressed samples, MIDI files, and this very underpowered system. This means that you get games that are ported from much higher fidelity consoles, like the PS1, and you get much more, well, let me put it this way, objectively worse versions, to put it lightly. I hold this. This is personally one of my favorite games. I played this game growing up. The Toy Story 2 action game. Has a fantastic, vastly underrated soundtrack. If you haven't heard it, go listen to the rest of it after this performance. You will not regret it. It is such a swinging good time. Cheesy. So here's the original, or at least a snippet of the original. All this is on CD quality, by the way. So this means that all the soundtrack can be fully utilized. It didn't use in-game choppiness, and you get all these subtle nuances, like the drum fill, or like piano solos that come later on. Where is it? Okay, I'm gonna get way into that way too much. Okay, so because of this, a lot of desperate measures had to be cut to make this game, this fantastic game, fit onto a puny little cartridge. And this meant that they had to get rid of cutscenes, they had to just replace some sample text, they had to ditch some songs from the soundtrack, they even had to rewrite them, make new samples, and even like rewrite melodies, put in less syncopation, which is basically like less swingy notes. It makes it sound more gridline. So, yeah. This is painful. Please make it stop. Okay. Oh, that snare sample is way too overpowering. It's way too much. Anyway, so for all of the badly written songs for this, there is, luckily, some lights at the end of the tunnel. This includes, or probably arguably, the biggest hero of the N64's composing history, Grant Kirkhope. And this guy, much like David Wise, realized just how much of in a predicament he was. You had all of these limitations on the software, and you only had so much space to work with. I think you had, for the N64, you had roughly, I didn't put it in here, did I? No. But you had roughly 160 megabytes to work with, 164 megabytes to work with. And this meant that you had to make really small instrument samples for the system to go back on, and even use some other samples from the game, reorganize them, and make them a different sound. For example, have you ever noticed how banjos, or like any character in Banjo-Kazooie's dialogue is more like hoo-hoo, 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 all those? So all of those are individual samples just rearranged and jumbled to simulate dialogue. In a similar vein, I'm sure most of you know this by now, but in Mario 64, when you hear Bowser's laugh and you speed that up, you'll get Boo's laugh, which is a great way to... So, yeah, this is a great way to save space. And also just reiterate that Bowser's been dead this whole time. But that's just a theory. I'm not going to finish that joke. Anyway, so because of this, Kirkhope used very, very small samples. That's about as long as the marimba samples got. So, something like that. So like that instrument was used a lot in the soundtrack, and that's because it's easy to convey. Musically, it's very versatile in terms of what it can convey, and it can make it can like sort of fit as an ornamental thing. It is very multi-purpose and very short, which is why it's used a lot in the soundtrack. Additionally, you get songs like Click Clock Wood and Gobi's Valley. If you listen here, you get, there's that marimba. And also these very small, very compressed wind samples, which is supposed to accentuate how this is, basically a tundra, but also this conveys the atmosphere of, I'm just gonna turn that down. This also conveys the atmosphere of Click Clock Wood year-round, which is still a good time. So, like, Kirkhope was able to do a very, very good job of creating an atmosphere while also working within its very strict limitations and admittedly fairly low quality. In the same game, he utilized a lot of oompa, 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 which is kind of that... something like that, and you'll get songs like Gobi's Valley. Oh God, that's fucking loud. So you get stuff like that. And it's sort of, and even that shamisen, that instrument creating a very dissonant melody is able to get that sort of pacing going on through the song. Now, before we gush over, so earlier I mentioned how some of these consoles were able to develop their own personality based on these samples. So, originally, with the NES, you have a very analog sound, very primitive. You have only so many instruments to work with, and no dynamic control, which means you can't go very soft or very loud. You have to make something that's catchy and memorable, something with character to it, that sort of transcends the the very monodynamic tone of these songs, which is why composers like Koji Kondo, composer of that famous Mario Brothers theme, he had to rewrite that melody 7 different times before he settled on one that complemented the console best, which just not only shows determination, but it also shows you can get really carried away with something that's supposed to loop forever. Oh, how about that? We also have a Super Nintendo that also kind of conveys that same atmosphere. But now that it has digital samples, we have all of these very synthesized sounds, very short, but also can give a very heartwarming sort of genuine sound to it, which will help sort of later refine Nintendo's identity as a whole. With that, though, it doesn't mean it can't be edgy. And I'm using edgy in the very loose term here because whenever you got sounds or songs like Doom for the Super Nintendo, they're fairly tame samples of what's supposed to be like a very crunchy, bass-hard soundtrack. And that is where the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD shine best, actually. Their whole attitude is to stay ahead of the competition, or more specifically, Nintendo. So this meant that they had to be on the edge of cool. They were way past cool. But they were able to make that really well with all of their really heavy usage of distorted guitar, record scratch. They were about as hip as they could be, at least for a video game console. So then you get stuff like the PlayStation, which I'd argue has the least definable personality of all the consoles listed here. Mostly because it was a little bit of a hybrid. It was starting to be the pioneer in a new wave of video game song production and processing. So I'd say that they were the most flexible, and because they were so open, they were the least definable in terms of which characteristics make a PlayStation game. Because Crash Bandicoot, a game on the PS1, that has its own identity. That is a very carefree, swinging, and overall it's meant to be a fun platformer. And then you get games like, go back earlier, the original Toy Story 2 game, which has CD audio, and it captivates more of the game's tone than it does the console itself. Now, the Nintendo 64 had also a very distinct identity. The N64 was able to captivate these charming synth sounds and create something that sort of like warms in nostalgia and also sort of simulates that. Some of these very human-like sounds that are a little bit more, how do you say it? It's meant to be very carefree and a little bit light on where it goes. And this means that it was also kind of underappreciated. So, moving on. Because all these songs and all these samples are on outdated hardware, this means that you have what's now a little bit of predicament. You want to preserve the culture. You want to get those sounds from Ocarina of Time. You want to preserve those sounds from Super Smash Brothers on the Nintendo 64. You want to preserve all these very, very classic sounds that a lot of generations resonate with. So this means that after the Soundfont technology was updated by EMU Systems and Creative from 2.0 in 96 to 2.01 in 98 to 2.04 in 2005. Yes, they skipped 2.02 and 2.03. Lord knows why. They really hate numbers. Either way. So now that SF2 has become the standard, this means that people are able to go into the ROMs and ISOs of games and pick out those sounds and map them onto a keyboard. And it makes playing them, editing them, and doing pretty much anything you want with them much easier on stuff like Windows, Mac, and Linux. Personally, I am a little bit of... I don't really use any of these. I use Logic Pro X's. presets, or rather, I use Logic Pro X's version of processing Soundfont, which is why I'm able to plug all of these samples into a digital audio workstation, because Logic Pro is it is one of the DAWs that lets you plug them in. If you don't have any of the softwares like Logic or any Ableton or anything like that, you have softwares like, you have softwares like, I'm sorry for the lack of photo op. So you get softwares like Polyphone, which is free for anyone to use, Vienna with 2 N's, sort of Creative Labs' attempt to sort of throw their hat back into the ring after Emu Systems acquired the license for it and sort of made it their property. Then there's Vienna with 1 N, which means nothing. The N stands for nothing, and you can basically it allows more playback with manipulation and sound fonts. Now I realized that I did forget to put a description for Swami, although not really, because Swami is more of a group of softwares that let you expand from there. You can sort of have different downloadable plugins as filters and branch out all from there, all from different raw stuff. Moving on, this is where the impact of all of these sounds come into play. So, more importantly, why do they matter? What's its importance? Why do we use these? Why can't I listen to Comic Sans in MP3 format? Well, the answer to your questions are hold on, and no, you cannot listen to Microsoft Word's greatest hits either. Anyway, so all of these sound fonts, they were able to give insight into how the sound production and quality production went into these into the earlier video games, and how they'd sort of guide composers later on down the road how a video game soundtrack should be crafted. It should be crafted with very catchy melodies, something memorable, atmospheric, flexible with where the player goes, and more importantly, how well does it complement and does it capture the tone of the game? Now, you also have all these composers that have all their creativity forced into their work. And because of that, you will have sort of the ability to breed creativity through limitation, sort of playing back to Orson Welles' quote. You also have, the ability to give each of your consoles a reputation. You also have indie developers being able to take inspiration from these golden ages, like Toby Fox or any other big-name indie developers in the studios behind Shovel Knight, and sort of inspire them to make their own games based on this sort of MIDI technology. And if you look in the files of Undertale, you'll notice that they actually do use sound fonts and MIDI instructions, which is why people were able to extract these sounds a little bit easily. And actually, here's a little bit of interesting trivia. Anyone recognize this sound? Maybe I play a little bit higher. Yes. Yes. And actually, here's another, so that tidbit, that instrument was also used in Earthbound. So Toby Fox drew heavy inspiration from Earthbound. I'm sure it's no surprise. He did mods of Earthbound before he made his own games, and that bit of SNES Earthbound feel never left him. And that bleeds through even into his instrumentals and his samples more specifically. Yes, it is more than just a sample of Patrick from SpongeBob saying, "Maybe it's the way you're dressed," and like taking a small sample of that just to make his all that, whatever it is. God, listen to me, that sounds stupid. Anyway, so here's just one last question I pose. Should we still be using them as like legitimate ways to write music either inside or outside of video games? I'd argue, of course. Why wouldn't you? I mean, I made a whole album that uses sound fonts or more specifically, like 1 or 2 songs. And I wanted to sort of capture that sort of 8-bit sort of tone with a little bit of a cheesiness of a love song. I can refer all of it to you later if any of you are interested. And outside of that, video game consoles, music production, it's vastly underutilized, I think. But that doesn't mean it can't be expanded upon. And if any of you were here for the opening and heard those same 3 songs over and over and over and over, I'm sorry. That's all I had for like a sort of warm-up thing. I couldn't find any other high-quality rips in the meantime. And yes, the YouTube channel Siva Gunner, who is known for their high-quality rips, which is basically an elaborate way of trolling people through video game songs. They use this kind of technology to more easily recreate all these songs and sort of morph them into something else, which is why you'll get songs like this, which is basically a song from Mario Odyssey, but using an N64 Soundfont. And probably more appropriately, because honestly that's a little bit too high quality, there's such a thing as too much of a high quality rip, like something that sounds too legit. I'm sorry, DS Music, I know you're listening to this. There he is. Oh yeah, if you're not subscribed to him on YouTube, he's trying to reach 10,000 followers before, or subscribers before sometime. And probably more appropriately, to sort of capture the essence of Siva Gunner, this is the a cappella version of the main theme from Mario Sunshine, but you'll also hear songs like Semi-Charmed Life by Third Eye Blind, and even in an SATB chorus arrangement. Then there's this, which is obligatory for any Siva Gunner rip. There's this, running in the 90s. There's this song by Hadaway, What Is Love? There's this. Fire Emblem, The Other Way Ride. And then there's this, which brings it all home, I think. It's a really nice touch. The file select from Mario 64. And if you listen really closely, as the song fades, come on, fade. That's Snow Halation as the bass line, which is also obligatory for Siva Gunner rip. Okay. So now that I'm done explaining basically elaborately well-composed shitposts. Why don't we move on to this? The I am thank slide, which is the time where I say I am thank. Thank you all for listening to the panel. Thank you all for coming out. I'm ready to take any and all questions at this time, or you can approach me after the panel. I just open up for anyone who has any questions about any consoles. So, fire away. Yes, lady in the... Oh, yeah. So, the Game Boy, I did a little bit of research on that. It turns out that the Game Boy has 2 sine waves per channel, a white noise channel, and another channel where you can program it to be any kind of waveform you want, although admittedly is only still limited to 1 cycle, as it is still an analog system. And that sort of gave way to sort of the distinct sound of Tetris and a bunch of other Game Boy games that still managed to sound somewhat like an NES, with like slightly more expressiveness. And arguably, I dare say, the best song in the Tetris soundtrack is Tetris Type B. Anyone else who thinks otherwise, fight me after this panel. Yep. Thanks. Want to put money on it? Loser pays loser pays the winner's hospital bills, or other way. Never mind. Sounds stupid. Anyway. Cool. All right. Yes.
Did the font itself have any kind of copyright ownership associated with it outside of the game, the composition, the actual way that the thing came out in the form of an audio?
So So at the time of like these SNES games being released, they only had copyright regulations on the songs themselves, not the individual sounds. Although EMU and Creative Labs have also taken into the idea of copyrighting a set of sounds to like advertise the keyboards from Roland or Yamaha or whatever keyboards they're looking to make. And from there, copyright law has gotten a little bit more. It's been trying to crack down or like try to keep things a little bit more specific. Don't quote me; I'm no legal expert. But there are certain companies that will sort of like be quick to notice if you're using their sound in a way that is making it sound like it's yours, which is basic copyright infringement. But other than that, Toby Fox was able to get away with using that Earthbound clip in Undertale. He was able to get away with that Patrick voice or that Patrick bit, and there are also some games that use stock free. Even though technically there were no I don't think there were any hard copyright laws on it. Nintendo still played it safe and made a standard drum kit for all of their system, which used a few copyright, royalty-free sounds. Hold on, I think I have some right here, which is right here. Here we go.
I guess I'm thinking of for modern creators, just pulling the sound right out of 64.
Oh yeah, you could just I think you could just do that because it's used in a way that's sort of transformative. As long as you're not trying to recreate the song word for word and call it your own, you should be good. You can use any samples. I've heard songs that yes, I mean I've heard songs where you hear Navi's voice and pitch shifted down and slowed down for lo-fi songs. And honestly, as long as you're crafty with it, you can get away with anything. Just a tip for any producer. As long as you're crafty enough, you can get away with using any sound you want.
But Trent Reznor is a country music.
Yeah, I don't know why we let Trent Reznor do these kinds of things.
I'm just saying. So the argument of you can get away with it is countermanded by you can't get away with it.
Well, there are cases that you.
But that's what, if you manage to transform it out of the clip, yes. But the fact that you're saying, oh, this is Lottie Blog's voice, I recognize it, suggests that maybe they hadn't gone wrong.
Well, sometimes sometimes they may not be able to go far enough, or if they're really, really, really concerned about trying to find money. In another way, if people are desperate, they'll try to find ways to find the samples and capitalize the hell out of it, or they don't listen to it that much and they don't think much of it. Any other questions? Yes, you in the back. All right, I see what you mean. The differences in quality. Okay, so they utilize the sort of PCM, channel, which lets you effectively use a technology that what sort of became to be known as Soundfont. For this presentation, I used Soundfont in the title to not only for a clever wordplay, but also for an explanation to help people sort of understand the technology a little bit better. So sometimes it isn't directly Soundfont, sometimes it's just PCM sampling from a processor chip. All right. If there are no other questions, class dismissed. Thank you so much. Oh, I forgot. Anyone wanted to check me out on iTunes or SoundCloud or anywhere like that, just type in NC space C. and you'll find me. Again, thanks.